Welcome, everybody. We're excited this evening to have Professor Edward Westermann to speak on Drunk on Genocide. We actually just finished a Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University Regional Institute, where Ed was the keynote speaker, and it's an excellent talk. Saw it last night, excited to see it again tonight. The Regional Institute was a success. Obviously, the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University was very generous, but this event would have never happened or been as successful if it had not been for ASU Jewish Studies, who was our biggest, most generous donor to this event. So I attribute much of the success to the generosity of ASU Jewish Studies. So I do want to thank Hava and Lisa. I also want to put in a plug for Genocide Awareness Week, because this is the unofficial opening for Genocide Awareness Week, which is the largest genocide conference in North America, which starts right now and also tomorrow. We've got a full week, April 4th through 9th. You can register online, attend in person here on the ASU campus or virtually, and just find follow the link, and it's free and open to everyone. So I encourage you. Father Dubois will be our keynote speaker for that. And we're excited to be hosting our first Genocide Awareness Week. And we're hoping to have this here as a mainstay at ASU for the foreseeable future. So Professor Edward Westermann received his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, studied with Gerhard Weinberg. And is a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M, San Antonio, great city. He's published extensively in the areas of Holocaust, genocide, German military history. He is the author of 4 books and 2 co-edited volumes, including Hitler's police battalions enforcing the racial war in the East, Hitler's Ostkrieg, and the Indian Wars, comparing genocide and conquest. That was 2016. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Berlin, 3-time German Academic Exchange Service Fellow, and J.B. and Marie Shapiro Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. His most recent work, on which he'll be speaking tonight, and again, this is an absolutely fantastic talk, one of the best keynote lectures I've seen, is Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which appeared with Cornell University Press and is associated with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in March 2021. So without further ado, I'm going to step aside and turn the floor over to Professor Westermann.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I'd also like to thank Arizona State University's Jewish Studies program for sponsoring this. It's been a great week with the Regional Institute and really some fascinating discussions we've had. Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that is a topic that gets a lot of attention in terms of interest, and the role of alcohol, especially among the perpetrators, is what I'll be focusing on. In a dark chapter in the history, which the Holocaust certainly is, the use of alcohol by the perpetrators, I think, as you'll see as I go through this presentation, is especially dark in that respect. Now, today I'm starting off, and the photo that you see on the screen is Police Battalion 101. They are now outside the Łódź Ghetto. It's Christmas of 1940. And they're celebrating at a Christmas party. And there's nothing really extraordinary about this photo. They're sitting down, they're drinking, they may have music, and they're enjoying the evening. However, I think we can complicate this picture a little bit when you see the photo that's now up. And if you look at that photo, what you see is they've incorporated a skit into their Christmas festivities. And the skit shows 3 policemen who have captured one of their policemen dressed as a Jew who's been smuggling into the ghetto. And what you would need to know is that for the past month, that unit has been involved in interdicting smuggling into the ghetto and making liberal use of their weapons. So what did they choose to celebrate? A parody of murder, essentially, was incorporated into their Christmas celebration. So I think we start to see In some of these types of celebratory ritual, we get an insight into the nature of what the perpetrators are thinking. And as I started this research, there were several things that I was interested in doing with it. First of all, thinking about what was the role that alcohol played in drinking ritual for the perpetrators themselves. And as I thought about that, there's a sense of literal intoxication that's associated with alcohol. But perhaps even more important than that was the idea of metaphorical intoxication, the idea of control of space and bodies in those space. And we see that, for example, in the occupied East. And what did that mean for the nature of governance in those areas and the natures of acceptable activities, which I'll be talking about. And as I continued thinking about this topic, another area became very clear to me, the importance of perceptions of masculinity in Germany. And so for our viewers to understand that there are very strict roles in gender roles in Nazi Germany. And in the case of men, there's very much a sense of militarized masculinity, a sense that men need to be hard and tough. And that's tied also to a racialized view of thinking about men and men's role. But there's also a performative nature. And so as I speak about performative masculinity, a competition with other men amongst men, and I'll be talking about some examples of that. And where do we see some of that competition? We see it actually in the nature of killing itself. We see it in violence against individuals, rituals of humiliation, and sexual violence that's integrated into some of these rituals. And then finally, for me, what was very important was this idea of killers who celebrate their actions. And I'll talk more specifically about that over the course of the talk. But it's important to think about how alcohol is used. And for the viewers, it'll be very clear that there are many functions of alcohol. And most of us would certainly be familiar with the idea of social bonding and celebration. This can be within a family context, a birthday, an anniversary. It might be within a work context among workers in a promotion, for example. But there's rituals associated with drinking as well. And some of those rituals are as mundane as students playing beer pong and testing their ability against other students, the ability to drink and to hold your liquor. We see how alcohol is consumed. For example, there's ritualistic use of alcohol in many religions. When we talk about this intersection of alcohol, masculinity, and physical and sexual violence, we're not just talking about something that happened, for example, on the Eastern Front or in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. That's a lesson that we see every day when we think about university fraternities and some of the discussions that we have about behavior, when we think about sports teams and the way that alcohol is integrated into celebratory acts. So these are lessons, I think, and they're insights that we gain that are broader than just thinking about a particular event. And they help us focus and to think about that event in new ways, I would argue. The selective disinhibition with my students, I call this the spring break effect. And the reason I use that is that the student who checked in to their hotel for spring break, and they're on the third floor at 10 a.m. in that morning, they're not thinking about it would be a good idea to jump off the balcony into the swimming pool. But maybe at 3 a.m. the next day, after having been drinking for a while and being dared to do it, that sounds like a good idea. So what we see, specifically if I'm talking about the Nazi East, is that there are some thresholds of action that people can only cross with respect to drinking. And for some of the perpetrators, that threshold in drinking involves the murder of children or involves the murder of women. And I'll talk more specifically about that. Perhaps the most innovative, I guess, if I'm thinking about this research, is the idea of how alcohol also facilitates violence. In other words, how those who are drinking decide that they want to become involved in violent acts. And I'll be giving some examples in this case. Incentive and reward. What many may or may not know is that in the East, the alcohol is used amongst policemen, amongst SS men, amongst members of the German military, and amongst auxiliaries who serve the Germans as a form of incentive and reward. And then finally, if you read the historiography that relates to alcohol, what you most often hear about is that the killers had to use alcohol to cope, and they coped with the murderous actions they're involved in by essentially getting drunk. And what I'd like to do is really complicate that understanding of alcohol. So in the time that we have together, that's what I'd like to do. Now, in the book, I focus on a number of areas, and this just gives you an idea. But I want to focus today's discussion on celebratory ritual, as I said, and what that tells us potentially about perpetrators. And the quote that you see is from Omer Bartov's Anatomy of Genocide. He's talking about Buchach. And he's talking in the book, he talks about how the use of entertainment, killing as a type of entertainment, that's kind of embedded in Nazi occupation in Buchach, that it's rarely discussed, this kind of entertainment function is rarely discussed in the historiography. And what I'd like to say is, in fact, you can find a great deal. Alcohol is a topic that in many respects been hiding in plain sight. And I'd like to go ahead and offer some examples of that as we move forward here. In order to go into the war, though, we really have to go backwards in time. And these behaviors that I'm describing, they don't exist only after 1933 when Hitler becomes chancellor. In fact, these behaviors are part and parcel of Nazi paramilitary identity from the very early days of the formation of the party and its paramilitary arms. And this is a picture of stormtroopers. And in the 1920s, many of these men were unemployed. They sought identity and they sought camaraderie as ex-soldiers together, joining together. And what they would have is they would have essentially essay pubs or essay bars where they would gather it. They would talk about military subjects related to the First World War. They would talk about the party. They would talk about their beliefs. And what they would do in those spaces that they took is they would in fact drink, they would share stories, and often they would leave those spaces to conduct violence against other groups, political parties such as the communists or socialists. And so we see this use of alcohol to form social camaraderie. We see performative masculinity of men performing to outdo other members or to demonstrate their own toughness. So this is something that is not just a creation, as I said, after 1933. It's embedded in the ethos of these organizations from early on. And if we look at primary sources, those sources from people at the time who are witnessing some of these events. I have the quote here from Abraham Plotkin, who was a U.S. labor organizer who traveled to Germany and wrote a diary about what he was seeing. And one of the most surprising things for me as a historian in doing this was how important music and song were in kind of number one, creating a sense of identity, the way in which songs are sung, the lyrics that were sung, the ferocity, the volume of the music that was used. And we see how music is also integrated into these rituals of drinking. And in this case, Plotkin himself remembers going to a Nazi rally, and he remembers the force of that music as a way to kind of generate support and camaraderie amongst the men. We see also that other scholarship has looked at the way in which these rituals then were transformed into acts of political violence. So if it starts before the Nazis take power, then where we really see the strongest impulse of this type of violence, this type of camaraderie, this type of what we would today call toxic masculinity, as how it would be described, is in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. These are so-called zones of exception. And what we see in the camps before the war starts in 1939 is we see that the guards themselves are standardized to think about being hard and being tough. And that is the measure of their strength, number one. That's a measure of their masculine identity. And it's also a measure of their SS identity. And that's stressed in their training. So what happens in these sites? Well, we see not only rituals of humiliation against the prisoners, but we see the way in which guards use prisoners as a form of amusement or entertainment. And when I talk about this, I think this is really an important point, that the way that the witnesses describe the demeanor of the camp guards is often overlooked. They played with it as if it was a sport. They'll use the term sport. It was like an entertainment. We were their amusement. And so when we hear survivors and witnesses use those terms, they're using a vocabulary that helps them to think about what they're seeing on the actions of the guards. And in Horbansprach, the language of destruction in Yiddish, there's the idea that many witnesses use the term of a wedding metaphor when they're watching what's happening to their communities as those communities are being wiped out. And again, for us today in the 21st century, I think it's important for us to think that tradesmen, peasants, farmers are searching for a language to describe how the perpetrators are acting. And the use of a wedding metaphor is the event that they ascribe to in the shtetl would have been one of the most joyous occasions that the shtetl itself could experience, right? The idea of music, song, and alcohol. And then they're using that language to describe what they're seeing in some of these actions. So I think that that's an extremely important thing to think about. Also, what does it mean? Why do guards compete against each other in the beating of prisoners? Why do they keep tally of what they've done? Why do they play murder games by throwing a prisoner's hat across a line and then having the prisoner go get it and shoot the prisoner shot while trying to escape? We're gaining insights into the way that the perpetrators are thinking about the individuals to whom they're abusing. And I have several primary sources that describe this type of entertainment, amusement that's taking place. And even the perpetrators themselves, in the case of Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant at Auschwitz, he himself recognizes after the war, as he's giving his death row memoir, if you will, about the nature, the reflection on the entertainment taken by guards in the abuse of some prisoners. So here again, we see this celebratory nature. We also see the integration of music as part of this, a staging, if you will. And I got from the Johann Niemann collection, this is at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, is available. And we see this is the SS canteen or SS restaurant or bar at Sobibor. And this is a place where men who have been involved in mass murder over the course of the day, only hundreds of meters away from them, this is where they relax in that setting. And in some cases, it's by, as you see, their own members playing the violin or an accordion, or it's by having prisoners who are musicians, who are kept alive as part of a Jewish workforce, as a work detail, performing for them, right? And this grotesque sense of the way in which music is incorporated as a punishment against those prisoners, but as an accompaniment to atrocity. And in the primary source you see here, the idea of throwing scraps to these individuals who are playing music, like one would throw scraps to an animal or a pet, the dehumanization that's also integrated into some of this performative work. Now, this is a source that talks about what I describe as the facilitation effect of killing. And it's describing how SS men come into a ghetto with the idea of killing in the ghetto. And the witness remembers, in the language that the witness is used, is the men are killing as a type of sport. But even more important, I would bring your attention to, when does this happen? Well, it's New Year's Eve. And like many of us on New Year's Eve, how do we bring in the new year? We celebrate with friends and family, we engage in drinking ritual. But what did these SS men, what did they decide that they wanted to do to start the new year? And the way they chose to begin the new year after their drunken revelry was to go into the ghetto and to kill Jews. That again, I can't look into the mind of the perpetrators, but their behaviors give me insights into their actions. So these are the types of sources that allow us, when we think about perpetrator mentality, to gain that kind of insight, what behavior tells us about what the killers are doing. This is a fairly well-known bar. It's the Kochmalna bar. It's in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's just outside the Warsaw Ghetto, named for a street in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's a police bar. So it's a space that the policemen, in this case, Police Battalion 61, have created as a place to decompress, as a place to establish that camaraderie, very much like those SA bars I talked about before the war. But if you were to see this bar, if we were to walk in and we were to be standing at the bar, one of the things that would first catch your attention is, why is there a Jewish Star of David hanging above the bar? A very cynical use of a Jewish symbol for men who are involved in mass murder. They incorporate that symbol into their area of entertainment. And if we were to turn around from that bar, one of the things that we would see, and it may be a little bit difficult to see from here, is that they created murals, self-created murals that depict their duties in the ghetto. And one of those murals actually shows a Jewish man reaching down to pick up a potato. And behind him stands a policeman with his rifle leveled, getting ready to shoot them. So this has been created as a place where the men can sit and drink, and they're essentially celebrating the actions that they're involved in. And the most striking thing, perhaps, for us is, before we even got into that bar, as we reached at the door to open it, what we would see is notches arranged in groups of 5, and each one of those notches commemorates a killing of that unit. So they're keeping count. They're keeping count of their victims. And ultimately, that door will have 500 notches carved into it. And this would be the space in which policemen would gather to talk about their duties, to brag about their body counts, to brag about what they've been involved in, to celebrate those acts. What we also see is, even amongst the perpetrators after the war, when they're describing some of these events, the nature of the language that they use, as I talked about, the idea of Yiddish incorporation of a wedding metaphor. But some of these German men incorporate the idea of festa, or fairs, or celebrations, in describing what they're involved in. And this language, the incorporation here in Sachsenhausen of the idea of those who are watching what's going on as murder orgies that are real parties, and schnapps poured in rivers, and music played over the loudspeakers. So the staging, if you will, of acts of abuse and murder that we see. We see this also in the killing fields of the East, and in this case, a Ukrainian village in which German policemen are involved in the murder of civilians and Soviet prisoners of war. And they have someone playing the accordion as they're doing this. So again, the integration, if you will, of music into acts of murder. And if we think about this picture of Sobibor, again showing someone playing the accordion, hundreds of meters away are the gas chambers. And one of the things we've talked about is the idea of it's not just a camp. It's also a camp that has its own signature. It has its own smell. It has its own smoke. It has a number of factors, and that this celebration is in fact centered in that area that we see as not a neutral type of site in that respect. Another really grotesque thing to think about is the idea that, in fact, that some of these murder sites are also sites of eating and drinking and music. And I know that Father Patrick Dubois will be speaking here during Genocide Awareness Week, in his book, Holocaust by Bullets and in Broad Daylight, actually brought this topic well into the mainstream of scholarship, that people, the perpetrators, are asking local Ukrainian villagers to grill, to barbecue for them. And they're going back and forth from the killing sites, killing, and then sitting down and eating and drinking. And one of the horrific things to think about that we normally would not think about is that some of the perpetrators, they talk about how the smell of blood and killing, that murder has its own smell. And then to think about they have to overcome that physiological smell to sit down and eat and drink and have music playing. And in many cases, in some cases, they bring women to the site. And this is where some of the perceptions of masculinity that I'm talking about, performative nature with respect to women being there to witness, not to participate, but to be witnesses to these actions of these men. And it seems grotesque when we think about the idea that, oh, these killing sites are hidden away, that people don't see them. And when in fact we see that they become sites like this of kind of bonding, if you will, among not only the killers, but their way to demonstrate their toughness or their masculinity to German women in this event. And we see this term, as I said, this is from a police testimony where he remembered a policeman in Police Battalion 303, where he's reflecting after the war in testimony on what his unit was involved in. And he described Jews being marched away and a band playing as they're marched away. And what he testified to, he said, quote, "It was loud, just like a carnival." And the German term is Volksfest. So that's a community event with music and amusement, a kind of a fair-like environment. And that use of the term, again, gives us an insight into the nature, I think, of what the perpetrators are thinking or believing they're part of. Another thing that we see is the celebration, the competition, in some cases, between the killers, where they're talking about the exact numbers of victims, where they're competing, boasting amongst each other, who has the largest number of kills, if you will. Almost like hunters will talk about who bagged the most geese, who bagged the biggest deer. We see that dynamic of masculine interaction. And this next testimony was one that struck me particularly. And it happens as a German administrator who was testifying after the war, who was interrogated by the federal prosecutor, remembered going up to the Deutsches Haus, which would have been a restaurant area for Germans only. And as he approached the front door, what he heard was this loud, raucous celebration. He heard music and loud voices. And as he's reaching to go in, there's a gentleman who comes out, an SS member. And that SS member is in uniform. And what the witness immediately noticed was there was a beer coaster pinned to his tunic. And in red ink was the number 1000. And as the witness asked him, what's going on here? The SS man said, "Man, today I'm celebrating my 1000th Knickschuss, or killing, which literally would be a shot to the back of the neck. So the keeping of score, if you will, the use of round numbers as a way to describe how good a man you are, how strong an individual you are. And that's not something that just is created, for example, in the East. That has its origins in the Nazi period, the so-called euthanasia or T4 program, in which you have these SS men, the prototype, if you will, the experimentation that will later be the gas chambers during World War II. You have individuals celebrating, in this case, one burner, quote unquote burner, celebrates his 20,000th corpse burning in this case. And another equally horrific example is during the deportations in the summer and fall of 1942 from the Warsaw Ghetto. As Jews are deported to the Warsaw Ghetto, we see at Treblinka, where the majority of those individuals are going to be killed, we see a celebration of the 100,000th victim. So in the camp, they're keeping track of the number of victims. And when they reach that special number, that's when they have a special celebration with additional alcohol and a party to celebrate that milestone. So again, not being able to get into the minds of the perpetrators, I certainly can get into their thinking by what they're doing. This is a picture of the Sobibor train station. And those who've watched Landsmann Shoah certainly would remember this picture. And what many people would not know about the Sobibor train station is there's actually an SS bar that's in this train station in which the guards would gather and drink and eat. And there's a Polish woman, because it's a train station, she's transiting through Sobibor, and she wants some cigarettes. And she sees a door, and she decides to go in because there's voices and singing, and she opens that door. And what she's struck with, as she later described it, I was struck by the extraordinarily richly covered tables, the unbelievable number of bottles of alcohol with foreign labels, the excess food. And why is that important? Where do those goods come from? Well, those are the goods that have been taken from those who've been deported to Sobibor, a killing center in which they're subsequently killed. But she also remembers German SS men and German auxiliaries sitting around these tables. And she describes them in a clearly drunken state. And her term is, they amused themselves. Again, the choice of the word she uses, and told stories about their families. A huge man played the balalaika and wore an unusually valuable ring on his finger. So she sees one of these SS men, and she sees him playing this music in this scene, and she sees that ring. And what struck me is in excavations, recent excavations that happened at Sobibor from a Israeli, a Dutch, and Polish team, one of the things that they found near the ramp, they were recovering artifacts. And it may be difficult to see, but these are the rings. These are wedding rings. These are engagement rings that were actually uncovered at the site. And I'll draw your attention to an unusually large ring with a red stone. And when we as historians can complement a testimony that we get from a witness to see physical evidence that forensic anthropologists or archaeologists are able to bring us, it again reinforces, right? It gives us a way to think about these events, perhaps in a new way, with new sources of evidence. In the case of Auschwitz, Johann Kremer was a doctor who was at Auschwitz, and he writes a diary that's been published in many locations. It's a very short entry, some cases only 2 or 3 lines. But one of those entries for November 8th, 1942, in a very short 2 or 3 line entry for his diary, how does he record his day's activities? Well, he remarks on being involved in his 12th and 13th Sonderaktionen, which would be gassings. So he's there for his 12th and 13th gassing. And then how does he end that short entry? by remarking on a cozy evening company with his comrades that included, quote, Bulgarian red wine and Croatian plum brandy. So the integration, right, of the banal, of camaraderie with a discussion of mass murder of thousands in the same entry. And as we look at descriptions and as we look at photos that are taken by soldiers in the East, here's a photo on the Eastern Front, and these are German military men, and they're celebrating Christmas, which again is not by itself completely unusual to see. But when you start to look at the labels of the bottles, you see that many of this is not coming from Russia or Eastern Europe. It's things that are coming, in fact, from the West and from Germany. And Ilya Ehrenberg describes the actions of German soldiers in 1942 as, quote, in our towns, they are violating women and hanging men. They are guzzling alcohol and sleeping off their orgies like swine. And we might think that that's Soviet propaganda from the period, that this is an overstated reaction of someone's country who's been invaded. However, what we also have is sources in which German soldiers are writing back to their parents or their lovers or their loved ones. And this is a letter from a German soldier, and he's in the East, and how does he describe it? The way it's hoard and guzzled here is incredible. So again, by bringing in different sources, we can look at these pictures, we can look at these photographs in a new way. And this photo, I think, is a really powerful photo in terms of not the action, but what's behind it. These are SS men. It's on the Eastern Front. It's winter of 1943, most likely, and they're drinking, but it's what they're drinking. They're drinking Moet et Chandon. They're drinking French champagne on the Eastern Front. And what that tells us about the nature of what happens to occupied territories, but also what's happening on the Eastern Front itself and how it's being supplied and how these individuals are using that as almost like a fraternity, if you will, drinking party here. We see this in other pictures, but I'd like to go ahead and kind of end this discussion before we have some questions by talking about what I think are the most important insights that we can gain. One of the things I think that is important is that alcohol has been a topic that's been hiding in plain sight. There's been many, many references to it. And when you start looking for it, you find it almost everywhere in testimony of not only the perpetrators, witnesses, victims, and survivors. Mention this often. That alcohol itself was a key mechanism in sharing identity and sharing mission. But that what's extremely important to understand is the Holocaust, the Shoah, happens with or without alcohol. It's neither necessary nor sufficient. But the way in which it's used is the way in which we're able to gain specific insights on the behavior and the mindset of these perpetrators. And in some cases, what you read, for example, Karl Jaeger, who was the head of Einsatzkommando 3 in the Baltics, or some of the SS senior leaders in the East, there's descriptions of them suffering from an inability to sleep, from suffering from intestinal problems. And for many historians, the answer to that has been that that's a psychosomatic reflection of what they're involved in. The fact that mentally and physically their actions are being taken out on their body. However, if you look at the literature related to excessive alcohol consumption, what you'll also see is that sleep, inability to sleep, and stomach ulcers and intestinal problems are also a manifestation of very large-scale drinking. And what I'm saying is not that one or the other is right, but what I'm saying is that in the historiography, we tend to think in terms not like Nazis think. We think about looking for explanations that make us feel better about, oh, they couldn't have done it. They had to have had these kind of physiological reactions to murder. And that may not be the case. And the other thing that we often see in the historiography is that coping was the only way in which these men could do what they did. And the idea that at the end of the day, they need to drink themselves into a stupor to deal with that. But if I were to tell you the stories that I've shown, or a Polish waitress who remembers how SS men would come multiple times a week to their restaurant, and they would come after killing actions. And what would they do when they got to the restaurant? They would eat, there would be music playing, they would be singing, they would conduct chariot races by pushing each other in chairs around the table. And they would also try to sexual advances to that woman. That scene is a much different scene in thinking about how these men are dealing with their daily actions than that they have to have their head down in a beer glass in order to deal with what they've been involved in. Now, the last slide that I'd like to share is a slide that I often like to use when I give any talks. And it's a picture, it's a photograph from an earlier book that I did that struck me. It comes from a German police archive. And oftentimes we use the number 6 million. And we think about that number of the victims. But there's also the question, who is 6,000,001? And the idea behind that question is, it's not a number, it's 6 million individuals. And for me, this is 6,000,001 and 6,000,002. Because what we have is we have a security service interrogator, and he's talking to this young woman. And there's a little boy next to her. And there are these policemen who are in the back. And I can't tell you what happened to that woman and that boy. But what I can tell you is in tens of thousands of cases, a woman and a boy found in the woods, found without papers, that they would be labeled as beggars, as a Jewish woman and a Jewish boy, as gypsies, as highwaymen, as partisan helpers, and they would be executed shortly thereafter. So this is a photograph that helps me remember it's not about theories of masculinity. It's not about academics. It's about individuals and their individual fates. So I look forward to your questions and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We do have we'll go with the online audience first and then see if we have questions in the room. The first question, Ed, is, was any of this information used as evidence in war crimes trials of the SS, for example, to document individual participation in mass murder and responsibility for mass killings at death camps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And paradoxically, it's used to exculpate the killers in many cases. And what you have to know about that is that the German legal code, not only during the Third Reich, but after the Third Reich into West Germany, there's a mitigating factor that's known as Volltrunkenheit in German. And a complete inebriation can be used as a mitigating factor for the actions of individuals. And so in cases where policemen are put at a side, in other words, where prosecutors are able to put them at the side of a killing, they often describe the fact that they were drunk and that they had to be involved in these murders, or that the only way that they could be involved in those murders was to drink. And it's a very cynical use of alcohol as defense. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on alcohol and celebratory ritual, because they're not talking about singing in the bar, about eating at a gravesite, about music and accordion playing. They're talking about their trauma, not the trauma that they inflicted.
Thank you. Got a few more questions. Dr. Westermann, was excessive drinking also a function of camp size and or type of camp, death camp versus concentration camp?
No, you see it. You see it in the camps, and I think as you know, that question really gets to the idea of there's an SS perception of masculinity, this hyper masculinity that I talk about in the book, and this idea of being tough and hard, the ability to be a man amongst men. But from a gender perspective, that perspective is also translated to female SS guards. And there's one female SS guard who remembered that she was told to be hard or to become hard as she's in her training. And so this idea that in the camps, this idea of there's no compassion, that being tough, being aggressive is important. And another case, which was really interesting to me in doing the research, that talks about how gender lines in the concentration camps can be crossed, happens when a male SS man is flogging a female prisoner. And one of the female SS guards takes the whip away from him and says, "You're not doing it right. This is the way you do it." And by doing that, she's not keeping herself in a gendered role of a German woman. She's appropriating the gender role of an SS man. And in the camps, this zone of exception, if you will, is one of the areas in which that type of behavior could be allowed.
Thank you. All right, they're rolling in. Would you not agree that alcoholism is endemic to all Western cultures, and it is impossible to establish that the Nazi use of alcohol is different from any psychopath's use of alcohol?
Yeah, in that question, what we do know, and this is where, for example, Chris Browning's Ordinary Men and the work of social psychologists is really important. We know that in a population, in a general global population, only 3 to 5% would be psychopathic, and the DSM now uses other terms, this diagnostic manual for psychology. But so, in other words, 95 to 97% of the population is quote unquote normal. So it's not about psychopaths using alcohol. It's about the way in which alcohol is being used by individuals. And the question also raises the idea of comparison, which is an extremely important point. So as I was writing the book, another aspect that we see of this type of celebratory behavior that involves drinking, music, barbecues, is actually in Rwanda. And in Rwanda, it's Urwagwa, it's banana beer, it's Primus, it's beer that's there, but it's also in the cabarets, these informal types of bars where the killers gather to either plan their expeditions and their hunting expeditions, where they come to celebrate afterwards to divide the plunder of their victims. And again, I think what we see is it's not that alcohol is not used by other militaries either. The so-called pejorative Dutch courage stems from the idea that rum or grog rations would be given to sailors before going into battle in order to kind of fortify their courage. That's there. The Soviet military has a 3.5-ounce vodka ration that they share with the troops. That's not really the point about the integration of the alcohol, that its presence is there, but how the perpetrators then integrate additional acts of violence, both sexual violence or physical violence. And I'll give you another perspective on this. Ruth Elias, who was deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. She and her husband are deported. She's about 20 years old at the time. She's pregnant at the time, but just in the early stages of pregnancy. And in her memoir, she survives. And in her Landsmann interview, she remembers being put in Block 6 at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And Block 6 housed young girls, but it also housed the camp orchestra, the male orchestra. And what she remembers is how at night she could hear drunken SS men coming to that barrack and barging through the door. And the first thing they did was not to grab the girls. The first thing they did was to wake up the orchestra and have music played. And then they would go after the girls and sexually assault them. And why is that important? Well, a phrase that I will never in my life forget Ruth Ilya said she's remembering the screams of these girls as she's on the third bunk, pressed against the wall, hoping she's not found. And she said, the music had to play. That music and drunkenness were integrated in setting the stage for mass sexual violence. And that's different from alcohol use in militaries or in other organizations in general. And that's kind of the point that I think is important to bring home. It's not that alcohol is not present in other contexts, but the way in which it's used and the accompanying environment in which it's used is an important thing to think about.
The next question is are there references to waterboarding games in some literature, and what exactly is waterboarding?
Waterboarding?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. Oh,
with Operation Reinhardt death camps, the question asks.
I'm not familiar with the term waterboarding in this case, so I would need some more context. But perhaps the questioner could type in the chat what they mean by that. But certainly within these camps, one of the things I've talked about is this kind of integration, if you will, of these sites of celebration that, as I mentioned, may only be 200 or 300 meters away from the actual gas chambers, right? That this is the way that these men are decompressing, as I showed from some of the Neiman collection.
Thank you. All right, one of my former students from a comparative genocide class, one of my best students ever, has a question. Can you, Carlos Castro asks, can you elaborate on how the historiography of the role of alcohol consumption in the Holocaust has evolved over the decades since? I know Browning discussed it as well in Ordinary Men in the chapter about RPB 101's first action.
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously a great student. When you're citing the sources that you've read in class, that's always gratifying for us as professors to hear those types of questions. And this was part of what generated this discussion. I'm very familiar with Chris's excellent and very influential book. And in Ordinary Men, as Carlos Castro obviously pointed out, that alcohol, the way it's used, at least the way the men testify about its use, as is a way to deal with the horrors of what they're involved in. However, if we read Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Furies, or again, if we look at Father Dubois' The Holocaust by Bullets, this is where we see a more differentiated view of the way in which alcohol is incorporated as a celebratory factor, as a group bonding. And the question also raises a really important point that I would like to talk about, because not every policeman or every SS man necessarily wants to be a killer, but those who remember these post-killing gatherings, they talk about the idea that you needed to be at them, because if you said, "I'm not coming tonight," what you were saying is not that I don't want to drink with you tonight. The way it was interpreted was you don't want to be part of the group. And by extension, you're rejecting what the group was involved in today. So in that respect, we also see the form of peer pressure and social camaraderie, the negative effects, if you will, of team building in that term that's being transposed into those situations. And it's much like the killers, as Browning describes them, who, when they can't kill or refuse to kill, the answer that they give to their fellow soldiers or their fellow policemen is not that I don't agree with what you're doing. It's I'm too weak. You're stronger than I am. I can't do this because I'm weak. And this is, again, where we start to see the intersection of some of these perceptions of masculinity that are socially enculturated into these men over this period.
Thank you. Maybe I'll see if there's any questions in the room. They're still rolling in.
Yeah. Can I just
yes.
get a new? Okay. So you mentioned, thanks for the really interesting talk. You mentioned the performative nature of some of the action that was going on is to prove one's masculinity or belonging. Was there any evidence in any of these diaries of any remorse that like, they performed to make it look good and had the 1,000, whatever, 200,000, however many people they killed, but then they didn't actually enjoy that?
That's a really interesting question, and it gets to a question that I've talked to when doing the research about police perpetrators from an earlier book. When you go to the federal prosecutor's office and you look at the scope of many of these investigations that are started, what you see is it's very, very rarely, and I've had the number 0 told to me by certain federal prosecutors, about a policeman after the war saying, I can't live with what we did, and therefore I've got to come clean. Where you see that many of these investigations come is either a survivor who provides information, or in some cases, a spouse, in one case in particular, a spouse who was in a bad marriage with her husband who was abusing her, and she goes to the police and she says to the policeman, oh, and let me tell you what he and his buddies talk about, what they did during the war. And that starts an investigation. So in many cases, it's not the men themselves saying they can't live with the memories of what they are involved in. It's the fact that they don't have that conversation. There's not, if you will, on the road to Damascus moment where Saul becomes Paul. In this case, you don't see that in very many cases. So that's a huge minority, if you will.
Thank you.
I'm happy. Yeah, I'd love to ask a question. Thank you. It was a great talk, and I'm just so fascinated by so many aspects. I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is the question, which you've already raised, of comparative analysis of this. And I'm thinking the Serbian case is especially appropriate. And I think your point, which is so important, that this was not a coping mechanism. This was part of an ability to commit cruelty that was ritualized as part of it. It didn't make it happen. It didn't allow it to happen, which I think is incredibly important for us if we start thinking about prevention and so forth, and avoid easy notions of AA to stop genocide or something.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that comment, because that when I talked about that metaphorical intoxication of control over the bodies and land of others, and as you mentioned, we see the same thing in Bosnia. The idea of alcohol and sexual violence, for example, is another classic example of that. If we look back at Rwanda again, the use of song and singing by some of the perpetrators, the sexual violence that's incorporated against Tutsi women, for example, as part of this. And so I think that's, that this is telling us something about mindset, as you said, right? It's not about this is allowing something to happen. This is being integrated in a performative way, or in a setting of kind of creating that situation and remembering it. So I think that's an incredibly important point. And one of my hopes in writing this book is that other historians and other social scientists who have looked at alcohol, for example, as a historian, my own research was really strengthened by looking at social science literature related to criminology, psychology, and sociology. And this is where, if we have college students, for example, and my own students, when we talk about how team building, community building can be a very positive thing, drinking with your fellows can be a great way to build that camaraderie, but it has that flip side. And this is where we can start to see it. And so I do think that one of the takeaways for me, especially, was that the social science literature, as a historian, allows us to get a deeper understanding of some of these dynamics, like the use of alcohol among gang members, alcohol and drugs, and rituals that are associated with drinking or with drug use, and violence that are associated with some of those rituals. And we can, I think, we can make some comparisons of that behavior when we start looking at these paramilitary groups in Nazi Germany as well.
Thank you. And that'll lead to the next online question. There was a question about whether or not it's known about the drunken Nazi or guards who frequently abused prescription drugs.
Yeah, Norman Ohler's book, which some of you may be familiar with in the audience, its English title is Blitzed, and he's talking about the use of methamphetamine, which was used in the German army. It has a nickname. It's called Panzerschokolade, which means literally armored chocolate or tank chocolate. And the reason it was used often by members of the armored forces as they drove long distances, it kept them awake. Pilots would also use this. In some cases, it's used by infantrymen who are on these marches, especially into Russia. In Ohler's book talks about this, but it's been criticized for creating direct causality. In other words, that the killers, the reason they killed is that they were high, they were intoxicated, if you will, on methamphetamine. And I think that that's a very kind of slippery slope and a dangerous road to go down. But the other thing I'll say, in looking at SS and police files and looking at tens of thousands of files and pieces of paper, and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the police, who writes about everything from don't be drinking, don't use your firearms, don't have your firearms at these parties, and writes about things like venereal disease among SS and policemen. I have not found one piece of information, one letter or one memo where he talks about a problem with the use of methamphetamine or Pervitin within the SS and police forces. And to kind of paraphrase Sherlock Holmes, this is the dog that doesn't bark then. Because someone who's so involved in these activities, when you don't find evidence that he's even aware of it's being used, I think kind of shows that at least within the forces that I'm looking at, it's understated. And the idea that 30 million doses of Pervitin, that sounds like a lot until you think of 18 million men who served in the Wehrmacht, and then you start doing the numbers. Now, were there individuals that got addicted? Absolutely, I have no doubt. But the kind of idea that it's an army high on drugs that's going into the Soviet Union and they really can't control themselves, I think is a very dangerous way to think about perpetration.
We got another great question about gender that you might have touched on when you discussed Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Furies, but Mary Ellen Page asked, did these female guards also use alcohol for the same reasons as their male counterparts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mary Ellen. And it's yes and no. And so, for example, when I talked about those stormtrooper bars in the pre-war period, they were male-dominated spaces. And sometimes women are allowed in, the wives or the girlfriends. But if they're allowed in, the men can drink and the women have to drink either soft drinks or water. And so you have this idea, the ideal view of German womanhood, and Wendy's book and Claudia Kuntz and others have talked about this, is that the good German woman doesn't drink or smoke, both of those. But what we see when we go into the concentration camps, especially in the East, we see that those standards of, if you will, of femininity, right, of women's gender roles are violated. In terms of those restaurants, those canteens within the camps, we see that men and women drink together. We also see profligate sexual activity in some cases. And so these standards that are applicable, if you will, within Germany proper, when we get to the East as a zone of exception, and especially in the camps, we see how they're renegotiated by the perpetrators. And what I would also add to that is the way Himmler, the head of the SS and police, describes what he wants his fellowship evenings to look like for men who have participated in mass murder. As he talks about, the men should have a half liter, maybe 1 liter, that's 2 beers, and that they should read poetry, and that they should sing and be transported into this beautiful atmosphere of German camaraderie. But that's the ideal. But the actuality, as I've shown on a number of these, on a number of the examples I've given you, is in the East or in the concentration camps, it has its own dynamics. And those kind of stated goals are often just disregarded. And in one case, in Minsk, there's a police unit that the commander has to reissue no drinking on duty, and it has to be reissued as a weekly order. And what's so interesting about that, from somebody who's already been, myself, and been in the military, is you don't keep reissuing an order. The only reason you do that is because the men are ignoring the order. So you have to keep restating it. And in fact, we see these alcohol prohibitions in Auschwitz discussed in Auschwitz as well, and the daily orders that come down in Auschwitz. So this is, I think, again, one of the insights that looking broadly at our source bases gives us insights into what the actuality of alcohol behavior and the actuality, the lived experience in the East looks like.
We got about 10 minutes left and a few more questions. I wanted to go back to the water bowling.
Yes.
The questioner has clarified and contextualized. In Operation Reinhardt camps, where the Trodniki guards were largely rewarded with alcohol for engaging in atrocities in a similar or in a different way than the SS guards celebrated in their murderous sprees. And I believe this is the same person. And my apologies for not citing the reference to water bowling. The water bowling method of execution appears in the testimony by Samuel Roshman, The End of Treblinka, in Alexander Donat, the Death Camp Treblinka documentary. And we do have a expert on Treblinka, a colleague here right next to me. And it is possible that the water bowling method of execution may not be properly translated to English, and your ASU lecture today is the most informative and educational. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And this is what I love about giving talks, is because I tell my students is I'm not just transmitting knowledge, I'm learning, and I appreciate the insight, because as you study this topic, one of the sad facts, and I've had other professors tell me, they say, just when you think it can't get any worse, then you hear a presentation like this, and it's like it just got worse. And I think that that one of the things we see is these worst manifestations of human behavior. And going back to the Operation Reinhardt camps, the Trovnikis, these SS auxiliaries who are involved, they are many times noted for how drunk they are and how their intoxication is reflected in an increased use of violence. And in an especially horrific example that many will know who have looked at the sources, there's a Polish store owner, and he remembers how one of these auxiliary guards came in and he wanted a bottle of vodka, and in payment for the bottle of vodka, what he threw down on the counter was a gold tooth, and that still had gums and blood on it as payment for the bottle of vodka that he was purchasing from that individual. And so again, when you read this type of behavior, when you see that, it's certain times where you go, that's enough for one day, right? It's time to end it and to stop research. But again, I very much appreciate that question and the clarification. And it looks like I have some work to do on sources myself. So thank you.
All right, we got a few more, and we've got approximately 7 minutes left. Is there any known uprising or resistance to these drunken celebrations by victims? Any resistance by victims against these drunken?
Well, there's what's interesting about that question is that the state of intoxication, in a couple of ways, that prisoners within the camp, there are certain guards who are marked, and prisoners are very aware of the personalities of all the guards they interact with. They become very sensitized to that. And many of them talk about when certain guards are drunk, they know that they have to stay out of the way. They know that some of the amusement, the entertainment games that I've talked about, that the probability of them being caught up in that type of activity is high. So they describe that. But also, what we know is at the killing sites, as the perpetrators drink, in some cases, they become more intoxicated and their aim becomes less steady. And some of the sources that we have that describe actually what happened at the killing sites is from survivors who were wounded or who weren't shot or who fell in to the grave and then are able to get out. And then they are able to tell us about what actually occurred. But I think that there's also a contextual factor that in the 21st century that we underrate. And some of those watching today might have watched the series Mad Men. It's about New York advertising agency in the 1950s. And if you watch this series, what you see is at 10 o'clock in the morning, they're drinking highballs, they're going to lunch, and these admin are drinking martinis. And at the 3 o'clock meeting, they're drinking as well. And from our contemporary perspective, we're saying these guys are alcoholics because it seems like that type of consumption is no longer something that is socially acceptable. However, if we were in New York in a working class neighborhood in the 1940s, and Pete Hamill's A Working Life describes those types of neighborhoods, and there's neighborhood bars, and it's a male only space largely. Women aren't allowed in. If they're allowed in, it's in the back room. And what's demonstrated there? Your ability to hold your liquor and your ability to use your fists. So what sometimes gets lost in the 21st century and 2022 is that the way in which culturally alcohol or violence has been encoded changes over time, and that we forget that and we interpret that evidence from a contemporary perspective, which often doesn't give us some of the insights that we could have gained if we were in that lived experience at the time. And that's why we need historians, because that's one of the things that we as historians try to do, is to try to create the context of what's happening at the time and how the victims are experiencing it, how the perpetrators, and how witnesses, how Polish peasants who live near these sites, how they're impacted by what's going on, how trains that pass through and people witnesses, how their testimony tells us about what's known or not known at the time.
Okay, we got two questions I'm going to tie together because we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think they're both great questions. Do you think these perpetrators actually enjoyed the torment and torment caused, or was it something with peer pressure, as you mentioned, with the 3 a.m. Rooftop patio dive into the pool? And I think this speaks to what you were just discussing now, Ed. Was the second question is, would you go so far as to say that the copious use of alcohol led to an increased use of alcohol with these perpetrators following the war? And if you could say something, if you could go briefly into how this affected post-war Germany.
Yeah, boy, those are great questions. Both of them really involve some great thought. Do the perpetrators enjoy what they're doing? And the answer is, I don't want to say that this describes every perpetrator, but the reason that I brought witness and survivor testimony and I used their language, because they're the ones there. And when they talk about perpetrators being amused in what they're doing, whether they're physically drunk or metaphorically drunk, and when they use killing as a sport, when they talk about the laughter of the perpetrators and the idea of children being put into a gas chamber and an SS man taking a handful of candy and throwing it in to the children as a gift as the doors being closed, right? I know that perpetrator is taking amusement in what he's involved in, whether he's been drinking or not. And so it's a difficult question. And social psychologists look at these ideas of what's dispositional, what's situational, and others have talked about it's the frame of reference, a wartime frame of reference, out groups. There's probably not one answer that everyone will agree to, but in this research, this is kind of what I've seen as another kind of view of the perpetrators that allows us through behavior to think about mindset. And that's for me what I've spent about 30 years looking at perpetrator motivation. That's what is important. Now, the second question that is also a question that I don't know if I'll do this book, but somebody should do this book. The idea of the use of domestic violence in Nazi Germany as a topic. And Doris Bergen, one of the leading scholars of the Holocaust that everyone in this room is familiar with, I know, has talked about, and I've talked to Doris about this, do we have a real study of domestic violence based on these kind of gender encoded roles that I've talked about in Nazi Germany? And we have some scholars who have looked at it kind of tangentially. But the second question would be exactly what the viewer asked. Men that come back from the Eastern Front in particular, who have been involved in these kinds of acts of physical and sexual violence, how do they act in post-war Germany when they're back in the home, when they're back in the local Kneipe or bar? How does it influence their actions? And I think that that's a fascinating question, and one that I hope, if I don't do it, maybe somebody in the audience can take that charge.
All right, well, at 6:15, thank you for the great questions. I think those are some well thought out, engaging questions, and appreciate you joining us tonight in our kickoff to Genocide Awareness Week. I know Lisa put the links into the chat for registration, schedule. We've got a great lineup, including a couple people in the room here. And yeah, check it out. And thank you for participating in ASU Jewish Studies program.